Welcome back to Smarter in 10, the podcast that brings big ideas to curious minds, one tight episode at a time. I'm David Peterson from the DMP Strategy Group, and today we're diving into a school of economic thought that champions freedom, distrusts central planning, and sees recessions not as problems to be solved, but as necessary corrections. This is Austrian economics, a perspective rooted in individual choice, sound money, and skepticism toward government interference. Let's get smarter. To understand Austrian economics, we need to start with its origins. The Austrian school began in the late 19th century with Karl Menger, who argued that value is subjective, determined not by the labor it takes to produce something, but by how much someone wants it. This was a major shift from classical economics. But it was thinkers like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek in the 20th century who turned Austrian economics into a full-blown intellectual movement. They challenged the rise of socialism, warned about the dangers of central banks, and defended the spontaneous order of free markets. If Keynesianism says spend to stimulate, Austrian economics says let the market heal itself. Core principles of Austrian economics. Let's walk through the foundational ideas. First up, methodological individualism. Austrians believe that economics starts with the individual. Every decision, whether to save, spend, invest, or work, is made by people with goals, values, and preferences. To understand the economy, we must understand human action at the individual level. Next, subjective value. There is no inherent value in a product. A glass of water is priceless to someone dying of thirst, and worthless to someone drowning. Austrians emphasize that prices emerge from preferences, not production costs. Then, spontaneous order. Markets don't need central planners. Order emerges naturally when individuals are free to make choices. Prices act as signals. Profits and losses direct resources efficiently, without any top-down control. Now, time and uncertainty. Decisions unfold over time and the future is unknowable. Austrian economics focuses on the process of decision-making, not just outcomes. This is why Austrians are wary of mathematical models that assume perfect information. And finally, sound money and the business cycle. Perhaps most famously, Austrian economists argue that artificial manipulation of interest rates, especially by central banks, leads to booms and busts. Cheap credit creates bubbles. Eventually, reality sets in, and the economy crashes. Austrians say, don't fight recessions. Let them run their course. So, the Austrian view of recessions is, well, pretty different from the mainstream Keynesian approach. Unlike Keynesians who want governments to stimulate demand during downturns, Austrians argue that recessions are actually necessary corrections. Why is that? Well, during boom periods, often fueled by low interest rates or easy money, businesses tend to make bad investments. These so-called malinvestments eventually collapse. A recession, then, is really just the market's way of cleansing the system of these bad bets. And, trying to avoid recessions through stimulus only delays the pain, and honestly, makes the eventual crash worse. To Austrians, the government is kind of like a meddling doctor. It keeps treating symptoms without actually addressing the disease. Hayek versus Keynes was perhaps the most famous intellectual showdown in economics history. Keynes believed in active government intervention to manage demand, while Hayek warned that such intervention would erode freedom and distort markets. In his book, The Road to Serfdom, Hayek argued that economic control leads to political control. The more the state manages prices, production, and investment, the more it drifts toward authoritarianism. Hayek actually won the Nobel Prize in 1974. A recognition of the Austrian school's warning about central planning and overreach. Critics often say, great theory, but what about real-world application? Let's look at some policy implications from the Austrian lens. No central bank manipulation. Austrians prefer fixed money supplies like the gold standard, or even decentralized currencies like Bitcoin. Let's look at some policy implications from the Austrian lens. No central bank manipulation. Austrians prefer fixed money supplies like the gold standard or even decentralized currencies like Bitcoin. No bailouts. When banks or companies fail, they should be allowed to go bankrupt. This ensures moral hazard doesn't build up in the system. No fiscal stimulus. Government spending crowds out private investment and creates debt burdens. Instead, reduce taxes and regulations to allow markets to correct themselves. Decentralization. The best economic decisions happen at the individual or local level, not from distant government agencies. In recent decades, Austrian economics has found new life, especially among libertarians and economic conservatives. Think tanks like the Mises Institute and scholars like Murray Rothbard have kept the flame alive. During the 2008 financial crisis, Austrian warnings about debt-fueled bubbles and monetary distortion seemed pretty prescient. Politicians like Ron Paul brought Austrian ideas into the mainstream, calling for an audit of the Fed and advocating for sound money. And in the world of cryptocurrency, many early Bitcoin adopters were Austrians. They saw crypto as a way to escape the inflationary tendencies of central banks and return to money that couldn't be manipulated. Criticisms of Austrian economics. Of course, Austrian economics isn't universally embraced. Keynesians and other mainstream economists argue that Austrians lack empirical tools. The Austrian school resists mathematical models, large-scale data analysis, and formal prediction. That makes it honestly hard to test their theories. Others say that Austrian prescriptions are just too austere during crises, letting banks fail and avoiding stimulus can deepen human suffering. Critics also point to the Great Depression, where governments that followed laissez-faire policies didn't recover as quickly as those that adopted more interventionist strategies. Still, Austrians hold that pain now avoids catastrophe later. And, they argue that artificially propping up broken systems only delays reckoning. Austrian economics is more than a theory, it's a worldview. One that prizes individual choice, limited government, and market-driven order. Where other schools see downturns as problems to be managed, Austrians see them as lessons to be learned. Where others seek stimulus and safety nets, Austrians emphasize discipline, resilience, and long-term health. It's not always popular, it's not always easy, but it's a powerful lens, especially when the world is tempted to print, spend, and bail out its way through every problem. It's not always popular, it's not always easy, but it's a powerful lens, especially when the world is tempted to print, spend, and bail out its way through every problem. Thanks for joining me today on Smarter in 10. If this episode expanded your economic toolkit, or challenged how you think about markets, share it with someone who loves to learn. Until next time, I'm David Peterson from the DMP Strategy Group. Stay sharp.